Thank you, Professor Dorsey. I think you have given a very broad view of what actually is happening in terms of different actors, both state-led and civil society or religious groups-led actors who are involved in this process of claiming a pie in the soft power, Islam as a soft power. A lot of question comes to my mind, but I think I'll reserve that for later and open the discussion. Here we have a number of eminent scholars who are with us today in audience. We have Professor Pant also, who is a former professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Sir, would you like to react or ask any question to Dr. Dorsey? So, okay, maybe there is some network issues. May I invite Professor Joseph Kishishian? Sir, if you would like to react.
Thank you very much, Muddassir. That was, James, that was a very nice presentation. And I learned quite a bit, especially from the Indonesian situation. Because
if you can learn from me, that says something.
That's very useful. That's very useful.
Thank you.
I want to ask you a question about two specific points that you raised, which obviously interest me a great deal. One about the Wahhabis and the second about Mohammed bin Zayed and what he is doing. And the two are related to a certain extent. I have recently written a chapter on Saudi Arabia with the Wahhabi question in Mehran Kamrava's new book on Routledge's Handbook of Persian Gulf Politics. And this question had not come to my mind, so that's why I'm going to ask you. Now, you said that Mohammed bin Zayed in the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, essentially claimed that they had been fighting with Wahhabism for about 200 years. Of course, this assumed that the Al Nahyan were around for 200 years, but that's a different question. But why do you think that the Emirates, other than this and other than the quest for soft power, is in dispute with Wahhabism when Wahhabism is not proselytizing in the UAE or elsewhere? They've tried that with Ras Al Khaimah in the 1960s and 70s, but it didn't go very far. And as far as I know, and that's why I'm asking you, as far as I know, Sheikh Zayed was not interested in fighting Wahhabism. Why do you think that Mohammed bin Zayed is doing something different from his father's policy? And that's the first question. The second question with Saudi Arabia specifically, now that Mohammed bin Salman has essentially decided, or it seems that he has decided to muzzle extremists inside the country by taking the mutawa'in out of circulation for all practical purposes, do you think that Mohammed bin Salman is in danger of the extremists, Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia?
Thank you for the questions, and they're both really excellent questions, and I'm not sure that I have all the answers to it. Let me just be very specific about one thing. What I said was that Yusuf Al-Otaiba, the ambassador of the UAE in Washington, who's very close to bin Zayed, said in an email to Thomas Friedman that the UAE had been fighting Wahhabism for 200 years. To be honest, it was a statement that surprised me too. I think what the importance of it to me was less how factual the statement was, but that it was part of a sequence, or a chain, if you wish, of indications that that Mohammed bin Zayed particularly looked down on the Wahhabis. Now, on the questions of why, to some degree it's speculation. I think you're absolutely right about Sheikh Zayed. But there is a point in bin Zayed's life in which he became very fundamentally concerned about, certainly about political Islam. And it's almost visceral. And yeah, let's be fair about it. You know, bin Zayed, whatever one thinks of him, he's one of the most enlightened leaders in the Middle East today. And he's been at this game of projecting a modern, forward-looking, cutting-edge state now for several decades. And he's done it very successfully. I don't think Wahhabism plays into that. Where I do think this plays into is what is a UAE strategy that they at times, very seldom, but at times certainly express privately, but at times have expressed publicly, which is an understanding at one level, at least, of what the limitations of their power are, and the belief that therefore they needed to work through a bigger entity, and that entity was the Saudi Diwan. And I think that you then got this dichotomy, if you wish, between between looking down on Wahhabism, almost to a degree despising it, but at the same time needing this alliance because it served a very important purpose. That's the best of an answer I can give you. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. On the issue of Wahhabism, and you know, you in many ways know Saudi Arabia better than I do, but you know, I think there are several issues here. Part of what I was doing with the remarks that I made and that I'm going to do in a book raises, and I mentioned this in part, raises the two fundamental questions: the relationship between state and religion in these countries, and the question of whether or not you can recontextualize Islam. With one, whether the state can do that, or whether it has to come out of civil society, and two, whether you can change things like in Saudi Arabia. There have been massive changes in Saudi Arabia in the last 5 years, without question. The question, however, is whether you can do that just simply by liberalizing social mores or changing national law, including what the UAE recently did with regard to the consumption of alcohol or cohabitation, for example, or whether ultimately for it to be sustainable has to happen in a theological, religious, legal process that gains traction. Coupling this back to Saudi Arabia, where I think, but I'd be very curious about your views on this, where I think that Mohammed bin Salman's future, what it depends on, it's on delivery of goods, public goods and services. It's on delivery of jobs. It's on diversification of the economy. It's on opening up opportunities. And if he succeeds in that, then the chances of you know, there'll be pushback, there may be some backlash, whatever, but the chances of a successful, for example, Wahhabi return, I wouldn't rule them out, but I also wouldn't bet on them. Now, if he fails, that's a different question. I hope that answers your question.
It does. It does, and I am very much concerned, like you are, about whether or not Mohammed bin Salman will be able, as he drafts this new social contract, to actually deal with or guide or not to dominate, but to guide these extremists and bring them back. He, of course, has said a number of times that he doesn't know what even Wahhabism is. He he is pushing for Islam, a moderate Islam. But as you said, time will tell. And we will have another opportunity to discuss this, I'm sure.
Let me just add one thing. I think, again, extremism is one of those terms that various people interpret in various different ways. What I think we have seen, certainly with the religious establishment in Saudi Arabia, is that it's been flexible, it's been pragmatic. It had a vested interest in the system. So I'm not really sure that, they may or may not, if things were to go haywire, suddenly switch sides. But I'm not convinced that it would be the religious establishment as we know it that would be the driver of any Wahhabi backlash.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor. May I now request Dr. Samina Hamid to ask a question?
Thank you, Muddassir. Thank you, Dr. Dorsey. That was extremely, insightful. The various nuances that you highlighted in this ideological battle. I'm curiously more interested in this Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia. My question is, why are they what they are? I mean, what's behind such positioning? And how does the contenders for power in Indonesia take such positioning? And do they rely more on the reinterpretation of Quran, or they are relying more on hadith or fiqh or other, texts or aspects of Islam? Thank you.
You're welcome. There are a number of answers to your question, because there are multiple questions here. First of all, to understand Nahdlatul Ulama. Nahdlatul Ulama is a movement that was started, it was founded in 1926, so almost a century ago. And it was founded explicitly as an anti-Wahhabi movement. It also is very much a movement rooted in the island of Java. And so there's a lot of Javan cultural influence. There's a lot of Javan, in a sense, mystical influence. And Java has a history in terms of the relationships between Muslims and others, in which Muslims were very tolerant and and not only just tolerant, very engaging. So that's something that is almost built into the DNA. And if you go back through documents of the movement, you find this, all of this. Abdul Rahman Wahid, whom I mentioned, who was at one point the lead. Well, let me take a step back. Nahdlatul Ulama, in a sense, is governed by an oligarchy. There's nobility within the movement. These are families from generation to generation. And they're Islamic scholars. These are people whose education has been in madrasas. They're not laymen. And Abdul Rahman Wahid, whom I never met, is widely viewed not only in Indonesia, but outside of Indonesia, as a visionary. And much of what Nahdlatul Ulama, and again, you're talking about a movement with 50 million people. So this is not a homogeneous unit. There are factions within the movement. But what I believe to be the most dominant faction within the group is very much the heirs of Abdul Rahman Wahid. Now, you've also got to keep in mind that this is a movement that has a checkered history. When in 1965, 1 million people, allegedly communists, were killed, not all of them, and not primarily in the cities, but in the countryside, they were killed by Nahdlatul Ulama's militia. And the militia takes pride in that until today. and they will speak openly to you about it. So, you know, it's not a movement without problems, but it's a movement that that is so powerful in a country that's by and large religious, not necessarily conservative religious, but religious. It's a movement that has incredible influence at the state level, an enormous grassroots power, and a significant base of religious scholars. So when a year and a half ago, maybe roughly, Nahdlatul Ulama came out with a ruling that essentially eradicated the concept of the kafir, which was the sort of the first step, and they need to move on with that, but nonetheless, the first step in legal reform, that was done in a meeting of 20,000 ulama. So, you know, you're not talking about a small group, or as in the past in terms of Islamic history, intellectuals who maybe, you know, like in the case of Ali Ashariati, actually did influence groups and whatever. You're talking about a mass movement, and you're talking about real clout. Now, in terms of the state, I forget whether 2015, Jokowi, the Indonesian president, laid the groundstone for what is supposed to be the Indonesian Islamic University in West Java. And it's been a slow process. The university has started to operate, but it really is only opening in September of this year. And Jokowi envisioned this as as competition primarily to the Islamic University in Medina, and maybe to some degree to Al-Azhar. But Jokowi couldn't pull it off. He actually went to Nahdlatul Ulama and asked them to roll out a plan that would allow the government to build on the university and various other things, and to start projecting itself internationally. And he realized he couldn't do it. Part of the reason he couldn't do it was because there was resistance within his cabinet from people who were afraid or were concerned that if Indonesia were to project itself in that form and fashion, the Gulf states may not be very happy with it. And they didn't want to risk relations with the Gulf states. So what has happened in effect is that the state has outsourced this to Nahdlatul Ulama. Now, Nahdlatul Ulama would have done this anyways, but it helps if you have state backing. And I think that conceptually was reinforced when the state also realized that when it came to diplomatic issues, Nahdlatul Ulama had access that Indonesian embassies didn't have. To give you an example, Jokowi for the last 18 months or so, prior to the taking office of Joseph Biden, wanted Mike Pompeo to come to Indonesia. Pompeo wasn't interested. At least he was not interested in a government invitation. What he was interested in was he wanted to, and he asked for it. He wanted to be invited by Nahdlatul Ulama. And when he came to Indonesia in October, his visit was centered around Nahdlatul Ulama, and he paid a courtesy visit to the president. So that's what you're talking about.
Thank you, Professor Dorsey. There are several questions in the chat box, and maybe I'll add one of my questions as well together with the
Please do.
reading the question. And one of the things which came to my mind while, I mean, and this is a question which comes quite often when talking about Islam, is usually when discussions on Islam takes place, it is largely considered as some sort of a homogeneous. And not talking about the sectarian divisions which are well recognized, but within the Sunni Islam or within the Shia Islam, the differences in terms of practices is I think extraordinary. For example, if one looks at the way Islam is practiced in the Indian subcontinent, or within Indian subcontinent, the diversity in which the practice Islam is. That is also something which usually doesn't come into debates and discussion. So maybe I'll ask your reflection on that, and maybe I can add another point which Ankita Sanyal, who is not able to use her audio, she has asked about the compatibility between the status perspective and the citizens' perspective on Islam, specifically in the Middle Eastern countries or say Gulf countries.
Well, let me address your question first. I don't think that Islam is any different from any major religion. You look at Christianity, you look at Judaism. I'm not less knowledgeable about Buddhism and Hinduism, but I would suspect, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the same is true. These are all religions with multiple strands that run the gamut, and multiple interpretations of what the religion represents. So I don't think that Islam is any different in that. I noticed that one of your questioners on the chat was asking about misrepresentation of Islam. And I'm happy to answer that question separately, but what I also want to say about it is, certainly in today's world, where you're dealing in a cacophony of voices, a cacophony of channels of communication, part of it is the onus on you, your ability to communicate. And often what you see is groups are not very good at that. And that's part of the problem. I'm sorry, what was the second question? Just give me the key word. You're off.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The differences between the statist Islam.
Oh yeah. To be quite honest, I'm not quite sure what that means. What I think is important is, and again, this is not a specifically Middle Eastern phenomenon. I think you see that across the globe. But what you certainly are seeing in the Middle East is that among the youth, attitudes towards religion and towards religiosity are changing. Younger people seem to be less interested, one, in imposed behavior, i.e. the state tells you how you have to behave or how you have to dress or whatever, and a less formalistic or a less ritualistic experience of religion. It doesn't mean that they're not that they're less religious or that they're not religious. Again, depending what country you're talking about, but it means that they're looking for a much more individual, a much more personal, and a much more, in some ways, more spiritual religious experience. On top of that, what you have in large parts of the Middle East is lack of confidence, and that's lack of confidence in government, lack of confidence in governance, and that's both political and religious. So I'm not quite sure. I understand the statist part of it. I don't know what the civilians part of it is. That's a bit of a difficult concept to quantify, but I hope that this answers the question.
Yeah, I think you have certainly reflected on the point which What I think she was trying to ask is that there is always the status perspective or state uh, kind of uh, back narratives of religion or other aspects, and then the way people want to practice it. And obviously, when it comes to the younger generation, they do not want things to be imposed on them, whether it is on religion or any other aspect. And I also,
Well, if I can add just one more thing to that,
sure.
It's not just in terms of, part of what's changing is that a lot of many youth question whether the state should be involved. And whether religion in that sense is an issue that the state should be regulating, or whether that's not something that should come out of civil society and out of the individual. So there are multiple issues here involved.
Certainly. Thanks for clarifying that point. We have Ahmed Tashfeen who wanted to ask a question. Ahmed, if you have any question.
Yeah, thank you, Muddassir. Thank you, sir, for providing me an insightful lecture about it. Actually, I have two questions. The one is regarding how much the push for moderate Islam from UAE and Saudi Arabia is going to be effective, considering that their moderate push do not match what their deeds are at their own country, considering what are they doing to their own people and the voices of dissent within the kingdom. And the second one is, don't we should say that this so-called battle for the soul of Islam is actually it's a battle for the geopolitical interest, because if we look at the history from last 40 years or 50 years since the 1960s, it is more or less the interests which are always been in the forefront rather than Islam. All these kind of things which the Saudi Arabia or the UAE is doing. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I think on your first question, we've got to define what is moderate. And we've also got to define what contradicts the religious aspects of this. So, with other words, there's been enormous change in Saudi Arabia over the last 5 years, certainly in social terms. There's both social in terms of women, in terms of gender relations, in terms of leisure opportunity, and so on. And there's been significant change in the UAE. I mean, the UAE has gone recently much further. They've actually legalized consumption of alcohol. They've legalized cohabitation, irrespective of marriage. Now, those are not small steps, and I think one has to recognize that. So the question becomes, what is moderate Islam? I would argue that in terms of religious tolerance, the UAE has probably gone significantly further than Saudi Arabia has. You have synagogues today in the UAE. You have temples. You have churches. You can openly on a street wear a religious symbol, and so on and so forth. Now, does that mean that the UAE is not an autocratic state? In my mind, of course it is, where no political dissent is tolerated, at least not publicly. Again, I think that's where the difference between what you see in Indonesia with Nahdlatul Ulama, which is a civil society organization and not a state, is and some of the debates, for example, in the last 2 years, some battles that went on in the Vatican where there were gatherings involving Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Nahdlatul Ulama, and others, either at the invitation of the Pope or hosted by the Vatican and the Pope, but at the initiative of the State Department, in which there were major battles on whether or not you embrace, in its totality, unrestricted, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was, interestingly enough, only Nahdlatul Ulama and the Jewish groups that were there that advocated the embrace unfettered of the Universal Declaration. So you get into these, you get into two issues. One is what constitutes moderate Islam, and two, is it something, through a legal process, through recontextualization, through whatever, that truly can be done by the state? That's not to say that the state can't do aspects of it. Now, on your second question, yes, it's about geopolitics. Of course, it's about geopolitics. In fact, it's about more than geopolitics. It's also about investment. However, what you have is today an influential Muslim world with a significant percentage of not only the world's nation states, but also the world's population. And it's a world whose culture, religion is in a sense on the front line because of jihadism, because of political violence, because of perceived intolerance, discrimination against minorities, and so on and so forth. So if you are able to project that moderate interpretation of the faith and use that to leverage influence in the Muslim world, you're actually gunning for global influence. You're also gunning for, that's certainly the case in Saudi Arabia, foreign direct investment. Your image and how you are perceived is one important element in terms of attracting investment and attracting all kinds of other opportunities. So a country like Saudi Arabia that's had setbacks, significant setbacks in its reputation, this is one way of significantly improving that, which doesn't mean that it's not about geopolitics first and foremost.
Thank you, Professor Dorsey. May I request Sir to have his comment or questions? Sir, you're on mute, sir.
Thank you, Muddassir. I have a small question because it's very surprising that, Emirate is becoming a major player in the battle. And probably some of the other countries will be a little disappointed that they are left out in your identification of major areas. And one thing is really very happy that, in the Indonesian case, the battle is taken beyond rhetoric. I think probably you are aware of it, probably Kishishian, probably others may not. In front of the Indonesian embassy in Washington, you see the statue of Saraswati. I don't think the Indian embassy will ever imagine such a thing in a foreign place. I think that is the Indonesian acceptance of the other, historically. And therefore, when you are saying that they are changing their views on dhimmi, which is probably a much beyond what others can do that. My only point would be, if Indonesia is moving far ahead, how are the others managing this challenge? In the sense, you are not only staying modernizing Islam, changing Islam, in keeping in pace with time. How do others, because by doing that, Indonesia is actually challenging the so-called Islamic powers, whether it is Turkey or Iran or Saudi Arabia. And that is not only within, but towards the other. And how this tussle is being played out? We only know about the sectarian division in the Gulf. Will this outreach towards the non-Muslims and the other, how that will be played out in the Gulf? Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for the questions. Let me just start with the UAE. First of all, I don't know that every Gulf state has the same ambition. What I do think is the UAE has done a number of things right in terms of its projection over a long period of time, in terms of not on political issues, but on the non-political issues, creating a society that many want to live in. And it has a leadership that's very ambitious and that defines its security in a much broader sense than many others do. Now, I would argue over the longer term, the UAE is using a window of opportunity. It's not sustainable over the long term. They just don't have the numbers and so on. And they've been very enlightened in terms of understanding early on that diversification and reduction of dependence on oil and so on was a necessity, but that will only, in my mind, take them that far. I think your other question is much more fundamental, and it has to do, and I don't know that I know the answers. What I think is certainly true is that the Indonesians build on a tradition of centuries of tolerance and live and let live in many ways, which is not necessarily one that's shared all over the place. There are there is also, the Indonesians also have another issue, which is that traditionally the Gulf, the Arab world, the Arab heartland, that's the heart of Islam. And the rest is a periphery. Now, I think that's starting to change in different ways. So if you look at the pressure that's going on unsuccessfully and will not work on Indonesia or Pakistan by not only governments, but by powerful non-governmental groups to recognize Israel, this is about Saudi Arabia. It's not about Indonesia, and it's not about Pakistan. But things become a lot easier for the kingdom if these major, most populous Muslim states, the states where you may see people on the streets, recognized first. So with other words, what I'm saying is, and I'm not trying to get into the debate about recognition of Israel or not, but what I'm trying to say is you may slowly, and it won't be overnight, get a reshifting of the balances here. Now, in terms of what are the others doing, I mentioned a little bit of it during my remarks. The UAE starting to invest in low-income housing in Nahdlatul Ulama strongholds in Java. And I mentioned the visit to the Nahdlatul Ulama headquarters in Jakarta by Muhammad Al-Isa, the head of the World Muslim League, that went less well than he has described it publicly. what preceded that? Now, first of all, that was the Rabita, the World Muslim League, is 62, 63 years old. This was the first visit by a Secretary General to the most populous country, Muslim country in the world. It didn't happen by coincidence. What preceded that visit was an incident in Mecca about a year earlier, where when Muhammad Ali Shah was in Mecca, and a very senior Nahdlatul Ulama scholar was in Mecca, and somebody very influential in Washington sent a WhatsApp message to Muhammad and said, "You really should meet this guy." And Muhammad Ali Shah texted back that he didn't have time. He was meeting some scholars from some African nations. He had no time, maybe a next time. And that didn't go down very well in Washington. And he then started to realize that this was a group he needed to start paying attention to. So I think you're going to see these struggles. Some of them public, some of them less public. Where I think, in some ways, what I would argue is where Nahdlatul Ulama's strength is certainly at the grassroots in Indonesia itself, potentially in Southeast Asia. It's starting to reach out to grassroots groups, and not unsuccessfully, Muslim groups in various parts of the world. But where it's really successful is at the elite level. Whereas you could argue that the Gulf states, and Turkey, by the way, and to a degree Iran, depending what groups you're talking about, are not only successful with elites, they're also very strong at grassroots levels in a number of countries. So, it's a struggle. It's not a battle that's won, in one confrontation, and it's not a battle that's going to be won overnight, and it may never be won. It may be one that just simply continues.
Professor, before we come to close, we have two more questions. If you have, if you can give.
My pleasure.
Faiza wanted to ask a question on the Nahdlatul Ulama. And she's an intern at the Middle East Institute in New Delhi. Faiza, you can ask a question.
Hi, good evening, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Good to meet you.
Good lecture, very enlightening, and a lot of this I haven't really studied in college, so it's quite interesting for me to, learn about these things. It's primarily why I took this internship. My question is that when we talk about the Nahdlatul Ulama, like you probably mentioned, that they are trying to reconceptualize Islam by preaching tolerance and, getting rid of certain concepts like infidels and so on. But it also has a highly disciplined and trained military wing, like you mentioned. I want to know what makes this military wing different from, other Islamic organizations, because as such, the history of violence is very ripe in Islam. So what makes it different from other military organizations? Doesn't having a military wing inherently mean that it kind of envisions that there could be violence, or they require force to deal with, certain issues?
Several things. One, I didn't call it a military wing. I called it a paramilitary wing. So right. These guys aren't driving around in armored personnel carriers with 50mm guns or Uzis or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a very disciplined in terms of the discipline, in terms of the uniforming, in terms of command structures, it's a paramilitary organization. That's one. Two, I don't think that, when we talk about moderate tolerance, whatever, that we're talking about pacifists. We're not. Violence is not excluded. So if you go back to, I think it was about 2 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, when a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir was banned in Indonesia. It was banned after the militia of Nahdlatul Ulama provoked violent incidents. They wanted the group to be banned, and they succeeded. Similarly, that's what happened recently with the Islamic Defenders Front that was banned several months ago. Again, there were incidents, and the Nahdlatul Ulama militia was involved in those incidents. Coming back to the what I was saying before about the meeting that Muhammad Alisa had with Nahdlatul Ulama in Jakarta. One of the reasons why that meeting did not work out well, that Alisa was accompanied by a senior member of the PKS, a political party that openly has said that it has affinity with the Muslim Brotherhood. It happens to be also a person who sits on the King Abdullah case. What is it? Joseph, help me out. KCRIS in Vienna or Geneva now. The King
Abdullah
Center for Islamic
Dialogue.
Yeah, the international dialogue one.
Yes, interfaith dialogue. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. He happens to be a member on the board. And the Muslim Brotherhood is something that's like a red cloth on Nahdlatul Ulama. A while later, the same political party, which comes back to your question, Faiza, the same political party was building a mosque in a village not too far from Yogyakarta. And that village is a Nahdlatul Ulama stronghold. And talking to people in the village and to people from the militia that sort of are people from that region, that neighborhood, if you wish. They made no bones about it, that if it went too far, the militia would step in. Now, again, what I'm saying is, I'm not saying they're violent. They're not violent as a matter of principle, but it's not that they, in specific situations, reject violence. And, again, it comes down to your definition of what is moderate. What tolerance levels do you want in an open society?
Thank you, Professor, for clarifying that point, and I think that also reflects on the larger, debate and larger practice within groups and societies which work in different parts of the Muslim societies. There's one last question which Ambassador Sanjay Singh, who has served as India's ambassador to Iran and who has also served as secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs in India. And he couldn't ask his question because of some audio issues. So I'll just read it out. What role does the guardianship of the two holy mosques play in the battle for the soul of Islam? And related to that point, were Ataturk's policies a natural corollary of the loss of the Arabian Peninsula?
Sorry, what was the second half of that question?
Were Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk's policies of taking Turkey to modernization and secularization a natural corollary of the loss of Arabian Peninsula to the Ottoman Empire?
Okay, on the first question, obviously the custodianship of the two holy places is extremely important to Saudi Arabia. And it's part not only, but part of the part of what Saudi Arabia bases its claim on leadership. And it's very sensitive about any challenge to the custodianship. And so one of the risks in this battle, and depending on what happens over time, not today and not tomorrow, but one of the risks down the road is that there'll be a more broader call for a broader administration of the two holy places, which is something that Saudi Arabia, I think, will fight with tooth and nail. With regard to Ataturk, I don't think what influenced Ataturk was specifically the loss of the Gulf as such, as much more a perception of why the Ottoman Empire was in decline. And that was a perception in the Ottoman Empire that preceded Ataturk by at least a century, if not more, where, in the early 19th century, you saw the Sultan and the Ottoman leadership looking towards Western technology, the way the West organizes itself, as the driver of reforms that they wanted to introduce within the Ottoman Empire. So I don't think that the driver for Ataturk to develop Kemalism, to use a shorthand, had obviously the decline of the empire as such, and that included losses in the Arab world, but I think the drivers were much broader than that.
Thank you, Professor. I think this was a very enlightening, discussion. Everyone would agree that you have given a very good idea and reflected on the larger trends in terms of various countries, jostling for, space within this idea of having a dominant role in the global Islam. And what stood out for me, at least, is how the UAE has been playing a very significant role, a very kind of formidable role in the current situation, even though in the long term that might not be sustainable. And the example which you gave about the Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia and the inherent contradictions that also came out during the discussion. So thank you again for taking time and for giving us this very interesting and very enlightening discussion on the battle for the soul of Islam. For the final concluding remarks, may I now request Sir to take over.
Thank you.